Hi guys, welcome to another HOI4 video. In today's video I'm gonna talk about ideologies in HOI4. My goal is to conclude which ideology is actually the best in HOI4. I think many of us know the answer, including me, but I want to prove that. As you probably know, there's 4 major ideologies in HOI4, or ideology groups. First group is democracy, with the subgroups of conservatism, liberalism, and socialism. The second ideology group is communism, with the subgroups of Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, anti-revisionism, and anarchist communism. The third group is fascism, with the subgroups of, let's call it Nazism, generic Nazism, fascism, Phalangism, and Rexism. And the final group, which is non-aligned group, which is basically everything else, consists of subgroups of despotic, oligarchic, moderatism, centrism, and anarchism. For the most part, subgroups have almost no impact whatsoever. One major exception is anarchism. As anarchist Spain, everything is technically different, but that's just anarchist Spain. If you would have a country which is unaligned and anarchist, it would make no difference from a country which has despotism, because this is HOI4. Also mentioning anarchist Spain, the main difference with it is created by focuses, and we won't be discussing focuses today, only direct bonuses and buffs and debuffs from the ideology itself. Actually, subgroups have just one single tiny detail, and that's opinion of countries. I'm gonna take, for example, Spain and France. France is liberal, while Spain is conservative. They belong to the same ideology group, which is democratic, and their opinion of each other is +10. Meanwhile, if the two countries are in the same ideology group and also in the same subgroup, for example, France and United Kingdom, both of them are liberal, instead of having +10 opinion of each other, they actually have +20 opinion of each other. Besides that, there is really no difference whatsoever, or I simply couldn't find it. So we can basically say that sub-ideologies don't matter whatsoever. Let's now compare all the ideologies with all of their differences. First thing we want to discuss is laws. As every single country with every ideology, you can basically always get disarmed nation, volunteer only, and limited conscription. Only exception is the USA, but that's not really because of ideology. In order to go for extensive conscription, as fascist or communist country, you just need more than 50% war support. Meanwhile, as democratic or non-aligned, you have to be at war. Enemies need to have at least 50% of estimated strength ratio compared to your army, which I'll from now on just refer to as army ratio, and you also need to have over 20% war support. So if you're in offensive war, you really need 50% war support before the war. To get service by requirement, as fascist or communist nation, you don't even need to be at war. You just need to have over 60% war support. As for non-aligned or democratic, you need to be at war. Enemies need to have at least 60% of army ratio, and you need to have either 60% war support. In case of an offensive war, that's 90% war support before the war, which is a ton of war support needed. Or you need to have more than 0% surrender progress, which means you basically need to lose one single province, and that will do. All.serve works the same for every single ideology, so no ideology is really better for that conscription law. Finally, scraping the barrel, just like all.serve. Every single ideology has it the same. You must be at war. You must have more than 85% war support or more than 25% surrender progress. And the enemy army ratio must be at least 100%. So they need to have as big army as yours. Next up is trade laws. Free trade and export focus are available to any ideology at any given time. To get limited exports as fascist, communist, or non-aligned, you need to have either partial mobilization, war economy, or total mobilization. While as democratic, you must be at war, and the enemy has to have at least 20% of your factories. And finally, closed economy, which is really only useful for the late game. You can close your economy only if you're fascist or communist, and for that you need to be at war, and you need to have either war economy or total mobilization economy law. And the next thing we're going to talk about is the economy law. Economy law depends a lot on war support. As for the economy law, you can get civilian economy, early mobilization, and partial mobilization at any point in time if you have enough war support, no matter what ideology you are. In order to get war economy, as fascist or communist, you don't have to be at war, you just need enough war support. However, if you're democratic or non-aligned, you must be at war, and the enemy country has to have at least 40% of your factories. And the total mobilization works the same for every single ideology. You must be at war, you must have over 8% war support, and any enemy country needs to have more than 50% of your total number of factories. Let's not forget, if you get total mobilization, you can do women in workforce. The easiest way to get women in workforce is if you're democratic or communist, you need more than 79% war support for that. As for fascist, you need more than 89% war support or more than 0% surrender progress. While for non-aligned, it's definitely the hardest. You need a bit less war support than fascist, you need only 84%, but you need to have more than 70% stability. Let's not forget that you need to be at war for this, so stability is going to be definitely lower than usual. Exact same rules apply for war bonds. Next thing I want to mention is not that important, but I noticed that if you're democratic or even non-aligned, AI tends to more often buy your resources. But take this with a grain of salt, I could simply be wrong. The next thing I want to talk about is rules or traits, which every single ideology has. One of those are intelligence rules. Basically, the more open your country is, the more intel the enemies are gonna have. There's 4 intelligence types. First one is civilian intelligence, that's basically factories, and it's worst for democracy and non-aligned, it's plus 20%, civilian intelligence to others. A bit smaller for fascism, that's plus 15, while for communism it's the smallest, it's plus 10%. Army intelligence to others is worst for fascist and non-aligned nations, plus 10%. It's plus 7.5% for communist countries and plus 5% for democratic. As for the name intelligence, non-aligned and democratic countries are once again the worst with plus 20%, communist with plus 12.5% and fascist with plus 10%. And finally, Air Force intelligence, highest among fascist and non-aligned countries with plus 10%, plus 7.5% in communist countries, and plus 5% in democratic nations. From what we've concluded, being non-aligned means everyone knows everything about you. Another important thing to mention is tension limits. Communist and fascist countries have no tension limits whatsoever. Meanwhile, democratic and non-aligned countries do. In order to guarantee other countries, democratic nations need to have at least 25% war tension, while non-aligned nations need at least 40%. Sending volunteers tension limit is 40% for non-aligned nations and 50% for democratic nations. To be allowed to justify on other countries, non-aligned nations need at least 50% war tension, while democratic nations need 100%, which is definitely painful. And also the country that you're justifying against needs to have history of generating war tension. In order to start lend-leasing other countries, as non-aligned you need 40% war tension, and as democratic a bit bigger 50%. To declare war, as non-aligned you need 25% war tension, and as democratic 100% war tension. And finally, to join a faction, you need to have at least 40% war tension as non-aligned, meanwhile as democratic you need 80% war tension by default, but if you're in a defensive war, if you are attacked by somebody else, you can join the other factions at 50% war tension. Also, all the ideologies, except for non-aligned, have a unique occupation law. Democracy has a very good occupation law called local autonomy, which is basically a better civilian oversight. It's gonna cause a little bit more resistance, but you also need less garrisons, and you're also gonna get more compliance every single day. Communist occupation law is liberated workers, which is not exactly great, but it's not useless either. It's kind of a mix of forced labor and harsh quotas, except resistance is going to be a bit stronger. Although it does require a decent amount of garrisons, it also gives you plus 30% local resources and plus 20% local factories. In my opinion, this occupation law is not that bad. It's useful if you occupy some very industrialized country, because this will basically give you factories for free. It's definitely useful sometimes. And finally, fascist unique occupation law is brutal oppression, which I renamed to trolling in my game, for obvious reasons. I'd say that this occupation law is kind of useless. It requires tons of garrisons. With it, you practically don't build any compliance whatsoever because it's obviously brutal oppression, but resistance is very low. However, you still need tons of garrisons to keep it, so it's not really worth it. It's probably better just going for a local police force. Let's now take a look at the rest of the traits, or basically what countries can or can't do. I'm gonna start with democracy. Democracy can declare war on democratic countries without a war goal, which is kind of obvious. You can't really do that anyway. Democratic nations can impose their ideologies on other countries, basically creating supervised state, which is kind of good, but at the same time it's bad. It's better if you could puppet, but you can't really puppet as democratic nation, which is a major disadvantage. Although peace deals tend to get bugged very often, and you sometimes get options to puppet other countries even when you're not supposed to be allowed. Democratic nations cannot justify war goals against countries that haven't generated any war tension, which I previously mentioned. They also can send volunteers by default unless it's changed by a focus or event or some decision. Another major disadvantage is that you cannot prepare collaboration governments as a democratic nation, which means you can't build compliance, and you also need to go all the way to Vladivostok to capitulate Soviet Union if you're playing democratic Germany. Besides that, you also cannot occupy territories owned by neutral countries. That really happens rarely, and that happens only if two factions are fighting together against one faction. Let's say that you're playing as the UK or the USA fighting in allies against Germany alongside Soviet Union, which is the Comintern, and you make a naval invasion into Leningrad. If you were non-aligned, you could do that. You could occupy Leningrad for yourself, but if you're democratic, it gets transferred to Soviet Union. Moving on, communist and fascist nations have basically the same rules. They can't impose their ideologies on other countries, which is true but at the same time not true. They can't create supervised states, but they can puppet other countries, so what's the point of them anyway? They can also send volunteers whenever they want. Unlike democratic nations, they can prepare collaboration governments, but they can't host governments in exile. And they also can occupy territories owned by neutral countries, as I previously mentioned. There are small differences between fascism and communism as well. For example, in the peace deal, communism has puppet cost of minus 30%, so their puppets are cheaper. Also, impact on joining faction and war tension is lowered by 50% as communist, and impact of war declaration is lowered by 25% as communist. So you're gonna generate less war tension if you're communist. Fascism doesn't have that, but fascism has one very powerful, very OP thing, which is why I think the fascism is so powerful. Time to justify war when at war with major power is minus 80% as fascist nation, which basically means you can always justify for only 25 or 30 days. And if you have some national spirit on top of that, you can justify for only about 10 days, or maybe even 5. Meanwhile, as a communist country, it takes you basically 4 times longer to justify nations, and you can't really expand quickly unless you got Wargo's true focuses. And finally, let's do non-aligned. It can't impose its ideologies on other countries, however it can puppet other nations. It can't send volunteers by default. It also can't boost supporting its ideology, but to be honest, who cares about that? For that, you really need intelligence agency, you can't do it like in the old days. And also, I just read on Wiki that you can't prepare collaboration governments as a non-aligned nation, but the Wiki is wrong. You actually can. Trust me, don't trust Wiki. Seriously though, I'm kind of a better source of information than HOI4 Wiki. It's kind of sad how much I play this game. Also, non-aligned nations have 2 nice things. Impact of declaring war on war tension is minus 75%, so you really generate only a small fraction of war tension you would generate. And the impact of joining factions on war tension is minus 90%, so basically when you join another faction you generate almost no war tension whatsoever. And that's it for the traits. I think that fascism is the best in this category, communism being slightly behind. Non-aligned is basically generic, while democracy has some really nice things but also some really bad things. For example, being able to guarantee a nation regardless of its ideology is very nice, but not being able to prepare collaboration governments is absolutely horrendous. Moving on, officer corps. So let's compare officer corps for every ideology. First things first, spirit of the academy. No matter what ideology you are, you can choose bold attack, tenacious defense, meticulous preparation, as well as inventive leadership. However, the 5th option depends on the ideology. If you're democratic, you'll be able to go for best of the best. This is going to lower army intelligence to others by 5%, and every new general that you hire is going to be a skill-free general. However, they don't get any personality traits, so you're going to have basically traitless skill-free generals. If you're communist, you'll be able to go for academy scholarships. This time, new generals will also not have any personality traits. However, they're going to be skilled too, but they're going to be extremely cheap. And also commanders as advisors are going to be cheap as well. Fascism and non-aligned have the same 5th spirit of the academy, and that's political loyalty. In my opinion, this is very good. There's one downside: all of your new officers are going to be either politically connected or media personality, which makes them worse. However, you can hire them before choosing political loyalty. That way you can have the cake and also eat it. And when you choose this, military leader cost is minus 50%, and most importantly, party popularity stability modifier is plus 50%. What does this mean? If you have 100% ruling party popularity, you're going to have plus 15% stability. And if you have less, for example, if you have 50%, you're going to have 7.5% extra stability. This is pretty useful. This is basically a popular figurehead. Very useful for small nations, but also useful for big ones as well. Like Germany, you don't need new generals as Germany really, and you can get 15% stability for free. The next one is Spirit of the Army. As for the Spirit of the Army, every single ideology has Professional Officer Corps, Elevated Engineering Corps, Proper Heritage, and Quick Improvisation. For the 5th Spirit of the Army, non-aligned countries have nothing. Democratic countries have Relief of Command, which means plus 25% army experience gain, which is definitely nice. And also minus 50% army advisor cost. So this is very useful to get tons of army experience. You get plus 25% army experience, and you can also hire all of these advisors very cheaply. As fascist countries, your 5th option is state serves the military. In my opinion, no-brainer, definitely useful, because conscription laws cost are minus 25%, and besides that, you're also gonna get plus 10% political power gain, which is almost like a silent workhorse. Communist nations also have something really nice, and that is ideological loyalty. Minus 20% encirclement penalty, and more importantly, plus 500 weekly manpower. For big countries, this is obviously pretty useless, but for some small nations like Vanuatu, or even bigger ones like Paraguay, This is very useful, which is about 28,000 manpower every single year. So if you would get ideological loyalty as Tanutuva, in less than 4 years you would have more manpower than actual population. I must admit that Spirit of the Army is good for every single ideology, except for non-aligned obviously. As for Spirit of Division Command, it's basically the same for every single ideology. As for the Navy, everything is the same for every single ideology, but let's be honest, it's HOI4 Navy. Not that nobody cares about it, but it's terrible. And as for the Air Force, almost everything is the same, except that communist nations can get Spirit of Air Force Command, that's called Steel Wings, Steel Hearts. Untrained pilots penalty for new air wing minus 33%, and that's basically all. Also, another thing I need to mention is that you can always convert to either communism, fascism, or democracy. However, you can't become non-aligned. Only way you can become non-aligned is if you get puppeted by other non-aligned country. There is no other way. Basically, you can't get a civil war, even if there is elections, even if you have 100% non-aligned support. That's kind of bad, but that's how it is. There's also one more important thing, and that is puppets. Puppeting is different depending what ideology you are. Here I am playing as Paraguay, and I'm gonna puppet Uruguay 4 times to show you what I mean. First time I'm gonna do it as Democratic Paraguay, and once we're on the peace deal, I don't have a puppet option for Uruguay. I can either do supervised state or change government. Changing the government won't make them my puppet whatsoever. They're just gonna become democratic. They were democratic anyway, so that does nothing. Going for supervised state is technically gonna make them my puppet. What do I mean by that? They're now supervised state. The thing is, I can annex them right away, but it says always false, so I can't really annex them at all. Also, every single day they gain tons of autonomy, so they eventually become free. You can just get a little bit of resources from them during that period. The second time I'm going to conquer Uruguay while I'm communist. This time I can puppet them. Puppeting them makes me just my puppet. This means tons of trade, and that's basically it. I can also have their manpower obviously, but besides that, nothing else. I'd have to send them tons of equipment to make them integrated puppet. Only then I would get solid industry boost with 75% of their military factories and 25% of their civilian factories. And that takes quite some time and equipment. In the third instance, I'm conquering Uruguay as fascist Paraguay. I really had to choose the two most confusing nations. Once again, I can puppet them. However, when I puppet them as fascists, they're right away integrated puppet, which is called Reichskommissariat, but it's basically integrated puppet. Integrated puppet with 10% less military industry. So communist integrated puppet is slightly better, but when you puppet a nation, they're not going to be integrated puppet, they're just going to be a puppet. So in very long run, communist puppets are better, but in 99% of cases, fascist puppets are better. You basically get 65% of military and 25% of civilian industry. And finally, let's conquer Uruguay as non-aligned Paraguay. I can obviously puppet them again, and this time they're also gonna be puppet, just like when I was communist. Lowering their autonomy to integrate the puppet gives basically the same results as communist. So in conclusion, puppets as democracy are the worst, as fascism are the best in 99% of cases, and as non-aligned and communism are basically the same and are the best in the remaining 1% of cases. Honestly, only time the communist and non-aligned ones are better than fascist puppets is when you're playing until 9060 or something like that. I think that's it. I can't really think of anything else that's different. And I'm gonna give a piece of my own mind. Starting with non-aligned nations. Terrible. Only good thing about them is that you can actually create collaboration governments. Also pretty bad, but some really nice features, like being able to guarantee other countries, that way trolling major nations. But honestly, unless you're playing on non-historical, there's not much you can do. You can only just get into World War II. As for communist ideology, I'd say that it's very good. You can do many things as communist ideology. It's basically like fascist ideology. There's only two things I can complain about communist countries. First bad thing is puppets. They're not integrated when you puppet a country, they're just regular puppet, which is pretty bad. You don't get any of their industry whatsoever. And the second bad thing is that you need to justify forever. Unless you got a national spirit or something like that, like Soviet Union can have. It's really painful to do world conquest, or even conquering your own continent or something like that as communist country. It takes forever. At most, you can get 4 justifications done in a year. And because of those two things, I believe fascist ideology is the best in HOI4, obviously not in real life. First things first, your puppets are gonna be integrated once you puppet them, unless you release them, but if you puppet them in the peace deal, they're gonna be integrated, and you're gonna get tons of their industry. And the second reason is justification. In other words, you can prepare 14 to 16 justifications in just 1 year, letting you expand very quickly. Also, if you're talking about generic focus trees, definitely going the fascist path is the best, but as I said, we're not going to talk about that in this video. You can also go for militarism if you're communist. You don't have to be fascist. And yeah, I think that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was somewhat informative and helpful. If you did enjoy it, like, share, and subscribe. Consider joining my Discord server. The link is in the description. If I missed something out, please mention in the comments. And yeah, see you in the next video, which is going to be an actual gameplay. Bye!